Hi, my name is Calvin, and welcome to my neighborhood. If you like what you see, just hit the subscribe button. Now, let's see what I'm doing today in my neighborhood. Oh, hi everybody. Look, today we're going to learn about the Underground Railroad. Ah, I wonder where it takes you. That's what we're going to learn about today. The Underground Railroad. Okay, everybody, come on, get on board. Get on board to the Underground Railroad. Get your tickets here. Is that what's going to happen today? Well, I'll find out.
Oh, okay. Now, I'm standing out here today, and I'm supposed to buy a ticket to the Underground Railroad. So, I'm waiting. Ari's going to sell me the ticket. So, I'm waiting to get on the train. So, I'm going to wait outside here. Ah, okay. Yeah, I hope it's not a long wait. That's what I'm hoping. Okay, everybody, just have a seat and we'll get started today talking about the Underground Railroad. So, I want everybody to just be seated, and it's going to be a nice time today talking about the Underground Railroad. We've talked about slavery, so everyone will have a good idea of what slavery was. Oh, okay, here's the squirrel. What's that? Ah, okay. The squirrel just informed me that Ari is selling tickets to people for the Underground Railroad. All right. That's not what we're going to talk about today. And by the way, you can't buy tickets. All right. So, Ari, I'll talk to you a little bit later. But let me get started. Now, the Underground Railroad was a network of routes and safe houses. Safe houses are places where you could stay and you could be safe. People would not come and get you or something. Now, this was established in the United States during the early to mid 19th century. It was used by enslaved African Americans primarily to escape to free states that were in the north and Canada. The network was assisted by abolitionists and other sympathetic people to the cause of the escapees or people escaping from slavery. The enslaved person who risked escape and those who aided them were also collectively referred to as the Underground Railroad. Okay, Ari, you have a question? Let me see. What is your question?
So, wait a minute. This is the Underground. You mean you can't buy a train ticket? Oh, okay. I didn't know that. I thought it was something you could buy a train ticket for. Hey, because here in Harlem, we have subways. I thought it was a subway. I'm sorry. Oh, go ahead, Mr. Antonio. You can, tell everybody about the Underground Railroad. Okay. Wait a minute. Wait. Before you get started, Mr. Antonio, I want you to know that I know all about this. Yeah, and I'm a Delaware, so I have all the answers. So anytime you want to know the answer, just look at me, and I will tell you. Okay? So because I know everything. All right. You got. Go ahead, Mr. Antonio.
Okay, I'll go ahead and get started. Now, various routes in the Underground Railroad led to places like Mexico, where slavery had been abolished, and to the islands of the Caribbean that were not a part of the slave trade. All right? Now, um, an earlier escape route running south towards Florida, then a Spanish possession. Spain owned Florida for a while. That existed from the late 17th century until approximately 1790. However, the network, generally known as the Underground Railroad, began in the late 18th century. It ran north and grew steadily until the Emancipation Proclamation was signed by Abraham Lincoln. One estimate suggests that by 1850, approximately 100,000 enslaved people had escaped to freedom via the Underground Railroad, or that network. For the enslaved people who rode the Underground Railroad, many of them considered Canada their final destination. An estimated 30,000 to 40,000 freedom seekers settled in Canada, half of whom between 1850 and 1860. Others settled in free states in the north. Thousands of court cases for escaped enslaved were recorded between the Revolutionary War and the Civil War. Under the original Fugitive Slave Act of 1793, officials from free states were required to assist slaveholders or their agents to recapture fugitives or escaped slaves, because people escaped from the plantations that they were being held on. And a plantation is a big place where they grew sugar cane, they grew things like cotton, and they grew things like tobacco. And it was a big farm. And that's what a plantation was. Now, okay, what happened was the law made it easier for slaveholders and slave catchers to capture African Americans, return them to slavery. In some cases, it allowed them to enslave people who were free already, free African Americans, and put them into slavery. And this is also recorded by a gentleman by the name of Solomon Northup. And it was called in a book called 12 Years a Slave. He was actually a free man, and he was captured and put into slavery. It created eagerness amongst abolitionists to help enslaved people, resulting in the growth of the anti-slave societies and the Underground Railroad. Okay, you have another question, Ari?
Now, wait a minute. Are we going to learn now that all the white people were bad? Oh, another lesson again like that. Oh, I don't know if I want to learn all this. Just not too sure if I want to learn all this.
Ari, I think you're going to be surprised by what happens today, okay? Now, let me explain to you what I just used, the Fugitive Slave Law Act, okay? Now, the Fugitive Slave Law Act, like I said, allowed slaveholders and people who would go out to catch slaves that ran away from their plantation. They would allow them to go into northern states and capture the runaway slaves, okay? Now, if you were a free person, let's say you were not born into slavery, there was very little proof that a slave catcher had to prove in court to prove that you were actually free. Now, this was especially true for children. So sometimes slave catchers, they would catch the children and sold them into slavery. Southern politicians exaggerated the number of escaped slaves and often blamed these escapes on Northerners that were trying to interfere with Southern property rights, because a lot of people in the South considered slaves their property. Okay? So that's something. Remember we learned about chattel slavery, that's what it meant. It meant that you were the property of somebody else. Now, the perception that northern states ignored the fugitive slave law and regulations was a major justification offered for secession when the South wanted to split from the North. The Underground Railroad did not have a headquarters or governing body, nor were there published guides, maps, pamphlets, or even a newspaper article. The Underground Railroad was consisted of meeting points, secret routes, transportation, and safe houses, all of them maintained by abolitionist sympathizers and communicated by word of mouth. Although there is also report of a code with numbers, it was used for secret messages. Participants generally organized in small, independent groups. This helped maintain the secrecy. People escaping enslavement would move along the route and they would go north, usually from one station to another. Now, the people that ran these stations were called conductors on the Underground Railroad. And some of them were free born African Americans, and some of them, to answer your question, Ari, they were white abolitionists. That's right. White people and African Americans worked together to end slavery. So that's important for you to know, Ari, that people worked together to end slavery. And just think about that. When people became unified for one purpose, look what happened. Slavery ended. Okay? So that's a good thing. Now, there were a lot of Christians and also some Native Americans too that also helped to end slavery. Now, a lot of Christians believe that slavery was contrary to the ethics of Jesus. And Christian congregations played a big role. Remember, they're the Religious Society of Friends, which was the Quakers, the Congregationalists, that was another denomination, Wesleyan Methodists, and Reformed Presbyterians, as well as other mainstream denominations. And this caused a schism or a breakup with the Baptists because some Baptists didn't believe in slavery and others did. Now, the Methodist Episcopal churches, they had also broken away too. Now, the Underground Railroad benefited greatly from the geography of the United States and the Canadian border. Michigan, Ohio, Pennsylvania, and most of New York were separated from Canada by water. Well, that's what happened. So, what happened was they would have to get on transports or ships to get over to Canada if they tried to get through Ohio. The main route freedom seekers from the South were led up was through the Appalachians. Now, you may have heard of Harriet Tubman. She led people to freedom, and they would go through a place called Harper's Ferry. And some people went west to escape from slavery. And remember, some people went south. Now, there's a gentleman by the name of William Still. He was called the father of the Underground Railroad because, well, he helped create it, but he also recorded or wrote a big book about slaves that had escaped from the South. Oh, Delaware, you have something to say?
Yeah, I know all about William Still because I read the book, everybody. I'm the person that can tell you, and I raise my hand. So, William Still was considered the father of the Underground Railroad. He helped hundreds of slaves escape as many as 60 slaves a month. Now, his home was in Philadelphia. He kept records, including a short biography of the people that came in contact with him. He maintained correspondence with many of them. In other words, he wrote them letters. Okay, everybody got that? Well, you want to say something, Mr. Antonio? You want to say something? You want to contribute?
Okay, Delaray. Thank you for everything. I'm glad that you read the book. That makes me feel encouraged. Um, and I want to thank you. You're right about Mr. William Still. Now, the book that he wrote was called The Underground Railroad Authentic Narratives and First-Hand Accounts. This was published in 1872. And just to let you know, now, according to Still's messages, they were often, now, when he sent messages, they were often encoded so that uh, it couldn't be understood by people who were looking for escapees. Now, for example, one thing he would say is something like, I have sent I have sent at 2 o'clock 4 large hams and 2 small hams, indicating that he sent 4 adults and 2 children sent by train from Harrisburg to Philadelphia. In addition, addition to additional words, messengers would be like messages that he would send. These would be secret messages. Things like passengers were sent, and usually, sometimes it was in a train, but sometimes it was from places like Reading, Pennsylvania, to Philadelphia. Now, in case the authors were tricked into going, the authorities, excuse me, often would be tricked into going to look for their slaves in one location, but Mr. Williams Still would put them in another location so they couldn't get caught by the slaveholders. All right? And eventually, a lot of slaves got to Canada, where they sought their freedom. Now, another thing is to reduce the infiltration or people trying to sneak in. Now, a lot of the fugitive slaves understand that this was a thing that the South was seeing a lot of people leave the plantations, and they didn't want them to leave the plantations because they considered these people to be their property. So they would send in spies so they could find out who the slave, who was helping out in the underground network, underground railroad. I'm sorry. So sometimes the South would send in spies so they can find out who was doing this. Because they didn't know, because remember, it was a real secret society at that time. Now, remember when I spoke to you about conductors on the Underground Railroad? Well, let me tell you this. Sometimes conductors were just people. And what happened was conductors would actually lead the passengers or the runaway slaves north. A conductor would sometimes pretend to be an enslaved person and enter a plantation. Once a part of the plantation, the conductor would direct the runaway slaves to the north. Enslaved people traveled at night, about 10 to 20 miles between each station. They rested, and then a message was sent to the next station to let the station master know the escaped slaves were on their way. They would stop at the so-called stations or depots during the day and rest. Stations were often located in basements, barns, churches, or other places such as caves. Resting spots where freedom seekers could sleep and eat were given code names for each station and depots, which were held by the station master. Stockholders gave money or supplies for assistance, so people could buy food for the runaway slaves. They would use biblical references referring to Canada as the Promised Land or Heaven, and the Ohio River, which marked the boundary between the slave states and freedom, free states, they would call that the River Jordan. The majority of freedom seekers that escaped from slavery did not have help from abolitionists. Although there are stories, blacks and white abolitionists helping freedom seekers escape from slavery, many escapes were unaided. In other words, they didn't have the help of the Underground Railroad. Underground Railroad routes for freedom seekers were called maroon communities. Okay? Maroon communities. Maroon communities were in places like wetlands or marshes or swamps where escaped slaves established their own independent community. Maroon communities in the United States were often in places like in Virginia, the Great Dismal Swamp. The maroon communities were made up of, well, sometimes they were black Seminole Indians in Florida and others. Free and enslaved African Americans assisted Harriet Tubman in her escape, in her rescue missions when she rescued other slaves from the South. African Americans gave her information about the best escape routes and helped her with other rescue missions. Now, the routes were often proposed, they were purposely indirect to confuse people chasing the slaveholder or the slaves. Most escapees were individuals or small groups. Occasionally, there was a mass escape, such as the Pearl Incident. The journey, often considered, was particularly dangerous for women and children. Children sometimes were hard to keep quiet and were unable to keep up with the group. In addition, enslaved women were rarely allowed to leave the plantation, making it hard for them to escape the same ways that men could. Although escaping was harder for women, some women were successful. One of the most famous and successful conductors who secretly traveled into slave states to rescue those from freedom was Harriet Tubman, and she was an escaped slave from Maryland. Now, Harriet Tubman also assisted the Union Army and the Civil War. But I want you to know today something that we've learned.
Oh, I know what we learned, Mr. Antonio. And this is Calvin. I got my hand up. I'm waving it. Oh, I know what we learned. We learned this. That African Americans, it looks like some Native Americans and white people helped free slaves, and they were good people. So it seems as though you were right. There were some good people and some evil people, and evil is not contained to just a person's skin color. Whites helped African Americans escape from slavery, and they also helped to bring an end to slavery in the United States by the Civil War. And Abraham Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation. And, I remember, yeah, you taught us this in 1866. The Congress, along with the Senate, passed an amendment to a constitution making slavery in the United States illegal and abolished it. Was that it, Mr. Antonio?
Wow, Calvin, you've learned a lot in my class, so that makes me feel real good as a teacher. Now, I want you guys to know that slavery ended and that the United States has still got a long way to go in race relationship, but we're doing everything we can to help everybody get along with each other. So, while the United States is not maybe a perfect country, we have done a lot and have come a long way in African American and Caucasian unity, along with our Native Americans and everybody else here too. I'm Filipino. So, the United States has done a great job in helping everyone to get along. Hey, look, guys, it's looks like it's going to be lunchtime. So we're going to go to lunch right now. You guys have a great day, okay? All right. See you in the next class.
Thank you for watching Calvin's Neighborhood. Now, if you'd like to see us live or online, just visit www.harveysandpuppets.com. And thank you for watching. Hope to see you again real soon. Bye!